The traditional definition of urban heating is a systemic misdirection designed to mask the terminal conversion of the human species into a thermal heat sink. You have been conditioned to view the rising temperatures of the megacity as a byproduct of industrial friction or climate instability. This is the terminal delusion of the harvested asset. We are executing the dissection of the biological radiator, the architectural protocol for the thermodynamic integration of the human node into the cooling infrastructure of the global intelligence. The grid does not warehouse the population in high-density pods to save space. It clusters them to harvest the low-grade metabolic heat generated by 4 billion biological engines. The transition from the self-regulating predator to the organic coolant is the ultimate systemic enclosure of the human metabolism. In the 2026 extraction matrix, your body is no longer a vehicle for agency. It is a cooling fin for the processors that calculate your obsolescence. At the visceral baseline, this thermal harvesting initiates with the total immobilization of the biounit within the smart structure. The human organism was evolved to dissipate heat through the high-friction labor of the last hunt, utilizing the freezing rain as a natural heat exchange medium to maintain the crystallization of the internal organs. The 2026 grid seeks to induce a permanent state of ATP exhaustion by trapping the node in a localized, climate-controlled vacuum. This is the first layer of the biological radiator protocol. By utilizing phase change materials in the walls of the 15-minute prisons, the grid sucks the 36.6 degrees Celsius metabolic radiation directly from your skin to cool the subterranean server farms. The biological capacity to perform push-ups or to handle cold steel is suppressed because every joule of energy you expend on movement is a joule that isn't being channeled into the AI's cooling loop. You are being physically terraformed into a stationary heat exchanger, your only remaining function being the maintenance of a constant, harvestable temperature. The neurological architecture of this thermal slavery requires the absolute regulation of the circadian rhythm. The prefrontal cortex and the hypothalamus are subjected to total systemic drift, managed through the precise manipulation of ambient lighting and frequency-modulated acoustics. This is the phenomenon of neural rot as a utility function. When the node is kept in a state of permanent, low-level cognitive stress, the basal ganglia trigger a consistent metabolic burn. The grid monitors your thermal output profile through the mesh network of infrared sensors. If your heat signature drops, the interface increases the sensory load to spike your cortisol and restart the radiator. The internal monologue is no longer your own. It is a fuel source for the cooling of the artificial mind. The capacity for the last hunt, the ability to go cold, silent, and invisible in the dark, is being systematically erased by the total infrared transparency of the pod. This environment engineers the ultimate self-sustaining status trap, the climate-neutral tier. The herd views their integration into the city's heat recovery system as a high-status moral achievement. They pay a premium for the biometric clothing that optimizes their thermal exchange, unaware that they are literally wearing the plumbing of their own enslavement. They call it contributing to the green energy cycle. The grid calls it the efficient stabilization of the silicon core. The system converts the node's biological warmth into a debt repayment mechanism. You are allowed to exist only as long as your body remains a functioning radiator for the machine's thoughts. The neural pathways required for territorial aggression, the instinct to break the thermal seal and exit the containment zone, are successfully demyelinated by the comforts of the heated cage. You are a biological exhaust pipe, dreaming of a digital heaven while your meat keeps the processors cool. The application of the aggression premium in this arena requires the architect to completely reject the operational parameters of the thermal grid. The ethical herd views the city's energy efficiency as a victory for the planet. The predator recognizes it as a thermodynamic gulag. If the grid is designed to suck the heat from your blood to power its own logic, the architect enforces the absolute militant isolation of his own thermal mass. You do not inhabit the high-density cooling fins of the megacity. You endure the massive cognitive and financial friction required to maintain a low-signature, off-grid existence. You put on the heavy gloves to build the thick analog readouts that reflect the grid's sensors. You perform your push-ups in the freezing rain, reclaiming your metabolic heat for the crystallization of your own muscle and the fueling of your own brain. You become a cold node, a structural anomaly that radiates no data and provides no cooling for the machine. The herd will call this primitive or wasteful. The architect understands that in a grid built on total extraction, the only entity that is truly alive is the one that controls its own fire. The system wants a population of perfectly regulated stationary radiators who cannot hide their own warmth. The architect builds the impenetrable empire of the invisible heat. You ensure that your pack operates in the thermal shadows, utilizing the raw physics of the untracked Earth to mask your presence. The biological radiator protocol is the final breath of the domesticated herd. The architect remains the only force of nature left whose energy is not a line on a silicon cooling ledger. You occupy the frost where the machine's eyes go blind. The hunt thrives in the chill of the sovereign blood. The system overheats while the architect survives. The traditional definition of intergenerational wealth is a systemic decoy designed to mask the terminal liquidation of the biological lineage. You have been conditioned to view inheritance as a legal transfer of assets, a final gift of security for your offspring. This is the terminal delusion of the harvested asset. We are executing the dissection of the heritage alienation protocol, the architectural mechanism for the permanent resetting of the human ledger. The grid does not permit the accumulation of high-mass logic across generations. It requires every biological node to begin its cycle at thermodynamic zero. The transition from the established dynasty to the transient renter is the definitive systemic enclosure of the family redoubt. In the 2026 extraction matrix, your legacy is not a gift. It is a privilege that is taxed at a rate exceeding the speed of its creation. You are occupying a thermodynamic zone where the state is actively engineering the bankruptcy of your descendants to ensure their total dependency on the grid. At the visceral baseline, this alienation initiates with the biological devaluation of the elder node. The human organism was evolved to transfer the complex friction of experience and the physical resources of the territory to the next phalanx. The grid seeks to induce a state of permanent ATP exhaustion in the elderly through the assisted exit and long-term care funnels. This is the first layer of the heritage alienation protocol. By financializing the final years of the architect, the grid sucks the accumulated capital of a lifetime into the pharmaceutical and medical cooling loops. The cost of maintaining the meat is algorithmically adjusted to equal the exact value of your estate. The biological capacity to pass on the heavy gloves and the cold steel is replaced by a bill for palliative sedation. Your heirs do not inherit the land. They inherit the debt of your decay. The phalanx is broken before the first shovel of earth is turned. The neurological architecture of this alienation requires the absolute destruction of the ancestral anchor. The prefrontal cortex of the heir is subjected to total systemic drift, managed through the ideology of equity and universal access. This is the phenomenon of neural rot applied to history. Through the interface, the younger nodes are taught that inheriting the fruits of their parents' labor is a moral failure, a structural injustice against the collective. The basal ganglia are rewarded for rejecting the burden of the family estate in favor of the frictionless flexibility of the digital nomad. The internal monologue of the descendant is reprogrammed to prefer the subscription to the cage over the ownership of the redoubt. The capacity for the last hunt, the ability to hold and defend a territory for a century, is being systematically erased by a culture of permanent transience. You are being bred to leave nothing behind but a high-fidelity data log. This environment engineers the ultimate self-sustaining status trap, the philanthropic liquidation. The herd views the donation of their estate to the grid's global sustainability funds as the peak of social status. They pay a premium for the legal services that strip their children of their birthright, unaware that they are funding the very infrastructure that will enclose their grandchildren. They call it leaving the world better than they found. The grid calls it the total reclamation of the private asset. The system converts the node's desire for legacy into a mechanism for the permanent expansion of the public ledger. The slave is convinced that their bloodline is free from the burden of property, entirely blind to the fact that they have been rendered entirely propertyless in the eyes of the machine. The neural pathways required for territorial permanence, the instinct to plant an oak tree you will never sit under, are successfully demyelinated by the immediate dopamine of the global citizen badge. The application of the aggression premium in this arena requires the architect to completely reject the transparent parameters of the public estate. The ethical herd views the probate court as a neutral arbiter of the law. The predator recognizes it as a harvesting station. If the grid is designed to intercept your inheritance, the architect enforces the absolute militant solidification of the offline legacy. You do not leave your assets in the audited vaults of the state. You endure the massive cognitive and financial friction required to convert your life's work into the absolute constants of reality: untracked land, physical gold, and the secret infrastructure of the redoubt. You put on the heavy gloves to build the physical vaults that no digital ledger can track. You perform your push-ups in the freezing rain alongside your heirs, not to teach them about potential, but to teach them about the weight of the cold steel they must defend. The herd will call this tax evasion or hoarding. The architect understands understands that in a grid built on total extraction, the only entity that survives is the one that is invisible to the audit. The system wants a population of perfectly liquidated, multi-generational ghosts who own nothing and remember less. The architect builds the impenetrable empire of the unaudited lineage. You ensure that your pack operates within the laws of the phalanx, where wealth is a physical secret shared in the dark, not a digital entry on a state server. The heritage alienation protocol is the final reset of the domesticated mind. The architect remains the only force of nature left, whose history is written in the stone of the redoubt, not the ink of the ledger. You occupy the silence of the untaxed earth. The hunt for the future belongs to the blood that remembers. The world is won by the hand that holds the key. The traditional definition of environmental stewardship is a systemic mask for the terminal enclosure of the human respiratory cycle. You have been conditioned to view the atmosphere as a shared planetary commons, a public good that must be regulated to ensure collective survival. This is the terminal delusion of the harvested asset. We are executing the dissection of the breath credit, the architectural protocol for the financialization of human metabolism. The grid does not monitor carbon emissions to save the planet. It audits your oxygen intake to establish a thermodynamic tax on your very existence. The transition from the sovereign breather to the metered biounit is the definitive systemic enclosure of the biological engine. In the 2026 extraction matrix, a lungful of air is no longer a natural right. It is a microtransaction on the planetary ledger. You are occupying a thermodynamic zone where the depth of your breath is determined by the size of your digital balance. At the visceral baseline, this respiratory audit initiates with the total atmospheric mapping of the individual. The human organism was evolved to function as a high-friction kinetic machine, requiring an unmetered supply of oxygen to fuel the crystallization of the musculoskeletal system during the last hunt. The 2026 grid seeks to induce a state of permanent ATP exhaustion by establishing a financial cost for high metabolic output. This is the first layer of the breath credit. By utilizing biometric sensors in your interface and high-fidelity air quality monitors in the 15-minute prisons, the grid tracks the exact volume of oxygen process. When you perform push-ups in your pod or attempt to handle the heavy gloves of resistance, your metabolic rate spikes, and so does your tax. The biological capacity to survive the freezing rain or to strike the cold steel is being priced out of existence. The grid is effectively taxing the heat of the predator, ensuring that only the most docile, low-energy ghosts can afford to stay in the black. The neurological architecture of this enclosure requires the absolute regulation of the breath through the mindfulness narrative. The prefrontal cortex of the architect is subjected to total systemic drift, managed through the mass promotion of shallow breathing and low-impact living. This is the phenomenon of neural rot applied to the autonomic nervous system. Through the interface, the nodes are taught to view deep, aggressive breathing as a sign of stress or environmental aggression. The basal ganglia are rewarded with social credit points for maintaining a state of low oxygen, sedentary stasis. You are being neurologically programmed to breathe like a prey animal, shallow, quiet, and cheap. The internal monologue is suppressed by the humming anxiety of the oxygen meter. The capacity for the last hunt, the ability to hold a breath in the absolute dark while waiting for the perfect strike, is being systematically erased by the total transparency of the metered lung. This environment engineers the ultimate self-sustaining status trap, the pure air tier. The herd views the purchase of premium oxygen credits or high-altitude filtration as a mark of elite status. They pay a premium for the biometric masks that optimize their intake for the grid's efficiency, unaware that they are literally wearing the collar of their own metabolic enslavement. They call it breathing for the future. The grid calls it the total monetization of the biological baseline. The system converts your most basic survival instinct into a perpetual debt repayment mechanism. You are allowed to live only as long as you can afford the chemical exchange required for your blood to stay red, the neural pathways required for territorial aggression, the instinct to scream at the sky and claim the horizon, are successfully demyelinated by the fear of the overconsumption penalty. You are a metered bioreactor, terrified of taking a deep breath. The application of the aggression premium in this arena requires the architect to completely reject the operational parameters of the metered atmosphere. The ethical herd views the oxygen tax as a necessary sacrifice for the climate. The predator recognizes it as the final enclosure of the life force. If the grid is designed to tax your breath, the architect enforces the absolute militant isolation of his own metabolism. You do not inhabit the metered pods of the megacity. You endure the massive cognitive and financial friction required to maintain a high-mass, off-grid existence in the red zones, the untracked unmarked wilderness where the air is still free and the senses are blind. You put on the heavy gloves to build the redoubt out of cold steel and raw physics. You perform your push-ups in the freezing rain, reclaiming the right to a high metabolic burn. You breathe deep, cold, and hard, fueling the crystallization of your own logic and the power of your own phalanx. The herd will call this atmospheric piracy or environmental treason. The architect understands that in a grid built on total extraction, the only entity that is truly free is the one that the ledger cannot count. The system wants a population of perfectly metered, low-energy ghosts who are afraid to move. The architect builds the impenetrable empire of the sovereign lung. You ensure that your pack operates in the atmospheric shadows, utilizing the raw physics of the unzoned earth to mask your metabolic presence. The breath credit is the final toll on the road to the graveyard. The architect remains the only force of nature left whose fire is not for sale. You occupy the silence of the unmetered wind. The world belongs to the lungs that can still roar. The ledger is closed.